So let's get right into it. So looking at EU, guys, for the next 24 to 72 hours, you guys do want to take into consideration that there is a couple of different ways this could play out, right? Simply for the fact that we are in critical areas right now. We can see at the previous, 115, 116 handle that has been a lot of buying pressure there, right? So it's all going to be depends on how that initial impulse does occur. If EU, in fact, could make a strong enough impulse to the upside, followed by some type of pullback, you could expect longs back to that previous 121, 122 handle. Now, one thing to take into consideration is that dependent on how this ascending channel plays out will warrant what type of movement it is, because this can be treated as just relief or liquidation for further continuation to the downside because of that initial impulse that was made. But if it does in fact make a strong enough impulse up, right, and does continue to flag out, right, your goal is to target the tops, right? But you do want to factor in, guys, one thing that head and shoulders pattern can in fact form, making this entire 115, 116 handle the base or the neckline. And once you crack that, that could be your entire big sell back to the downside. So be very careful on what happens within the next 24 to 72 hours, because that's going to be your ultimate dictation on how are you going to treat this in the short-term ascending trend, right? Treat it as aggressive, treat it as moderate. Be very careful on that. Looking at it from a 4-hour time frame as of right now, we can see that US dollar did in fact break out of the descending trend line and, more importantly, create short-term higher highs, breaking that previous high, creating higher highs. And so with that, guys, one thing to factor in is that this is the next previous high that was acting as a low back in the day. And so with that, what we want to see is two things. Either A, structure impulses to the upside, followed by a short-term pullback or liquidation. And from there, you're going to look to buy that all the way back to the tops. Please factor in that you are at a critical level here on the weekly resistance. And so in reality, you probably want a bigger impulse above the weekly resistance, a short-term pullback, and you guys can look to ride that up. You ideally want to be above the weekly resistance, but you guys can trade within here. Now, if that initial impulse does not occur, I would not be surprised if we pull back, create a structural retest, and break out and start rallying back to the weekly resistance. That is a possibility as well. The only way a sell opportunity would occur is if, in fact, this does break out strong enough with a sharp impulse, small pullback, and you guys can look to run that all the way back to the downside. But the real sell wouldn't be safe unless this first broke out with a strong enough impulse of pullback and you guys are looking to run it down to the weekly support. You guys don't want to be playing with anything below that. So the sells are quite critical because you are dealing with monthly and weekly. The buys do have some more possibilities. Once again, be careful because you guys want to see how are you guys going to treat that entire bullish movement, simply for the fact that you are expecting structure to come back to this previous low. And from there, it's going to be a dictation of if this does impulse up, it starts to flag out and starts to break out near there, are we going to treat this as relief liquidation for further continuation back to the downside, right? Or are we actually going to break out, small continuation, and start tagging one more time that weekly resistance? So that is something that you want to factor in. USD CAD on the daily time frame, start with the weekly. Actually, we were stating once again that you were treating that entire bullish momentum as short-term and as aggressive, simply for the fact that you guys can see that CAD's behavior starts as follows: with an impulse, a relief or liquidation, pullback, followed by another impulse, and now we are in that same phase. And so really two ways this is going to play out. Once this small-term ascending trend breaks, we're either going to see a big enough impulse, and that's just going to drag all the way to the downside, just like we saw the initial push occur in May of 2017. Now, if that doesn't occur, right, we're going to expect structure to pull down, start to decelerate, pull back, create short-term relief, and then start to leg to the downside. We are expecting that at some point. But pulling it to the daily time frame, right, we can see here, guys, that USD CAD has in fact falsely broken those previous highs, right? That 129, 130 handle was not something that you guys were looking to fight with, simply for the fact that you can see in the past, like we were stating on the longer time frames, that that was acting as a very strong area for the buyers. And so with that, guys, you want to be very careful on acting in that area, simply for the fact that you can see how hard the buyers fought to win. And so once the sellers took off, right, they took control, they're saying now it's our territory, right? And so completely understandable why we're seeing a lot of whipsaw, or we're seeing a lot of false movements. And so as of right now, you guys want to be careful with any type of bullish movements, right? We are seeing these false breaks on that monthly resistance. It makes a lot of sense on why that's occurring. And so we are looking to just simply sell the rallies back to the base of the consolidation and nothing more, because you do want to factor in one thing. That is the initial impulse, right? And so this is kind of what CAD has been sitting in for quite some time now. And so what do we see? We do see first false break 1, and now we are going to count this as false break 2, right? Potentially even false break 3 if you want us to look at those. And so with that, how have they all played out? Well, they've made a strong enough impulse, right? they will make a small pullback and they will drop one more. We've made that initial impulse. Whenever this does break out, right, whether it comes to here and creates a structural retest and then starts to drop, right, it doesn't matter. That is your ultimate sell. So the moment that this flag breaks out, look to sell that to the base of the consolidation box, because from that could turn into short-term relief, right, for another leg back to the upside. The only way it becomes a definite sell is if and only if we do break that low, followed by short-term continuation pattern, and you run that back to the weekly support. But ideally, if your ultimate goal is to take that, right, and start running it to that weekly support, you got to take an entry within there, because then you've missed the entirety of the trade if you start getting in within there. Okay, so USD JPY, starting with the weekly time frame, we did state once again, guys, that initial bullish movement should be treated as relief as well as short term, simply for the fact that you have to look at the way that UJ broke. This was the initial impulse, this was the relief, saw another impulse, right? Therefore, this was treated as relief. One thing to take into consideration is that once that entire base was broken, therefore this does become invalid now. And so what we are looking for, guys, is we are stating that this is the initial impulse now, because this entire area did in fact get broken at the start of 2018. This was treated as relief, and we are expecting continuation all the way back down to that monthly support at 100. Then from there, guys, we will warrant that entire movement as short-term relief, right, because of that initial impulse to the upside. And so if you guys actually take a look at it, this would actually look like simply just a huge flag or liquidation for another continuation back to the upside. And you guys can see that even clear on the monthly time frame, guys, as this was the initial impulse that I was stating. So if you guys are a bit confused on what that meant, guys, basically what I'm stating here is short term this was the short term bullish movement to the upside. Now we are seeing continuations to the downside. Our goal is to get to that 100 handle, and then from there we're going to look for the longer term buy. So short term, we are still looking, medium term, we're looking for sells. Long term, still looking for buys. And so looking at UJ on the smaller time frames, we can see that it did in fact falsely break that 110 handle, with that being the initial break, this being the false break. And so with that, we can see that the behavior formed with an impulse followed by a pullback and another drop to the base of the consolidation. Same thing like I was saying with CAD, I'm saying with UJ. This is setting up as a beautiful sell setup in the moment that this flag does in fact break, plus create short-term lower lows. From there, you're looking to sell that all the way back down to that daily support around 106.70, and that's going to be your sell. The only way it would become a buy, guys, is if and only if we did in fact create higher highs by breaking above that 109.06 with a strong enough impulse followed by a short-term continuation pattern, and you can look around that all the way back to the upside. That might create an inverted head and shoulders for you, and from that 109.8 handle being your neckline. One thing to take into consideration is that until we do break below or above the consolidation box, once again, guys, it is going to be any man's game, or any person's game for that matter. And so you really do want to be careful on what you guys end up doing when trading within here. Safest trades are going to be below the consolidation, right, once that breaks out, or above the previous high, small pullback, and try to run it back to the tops and potentially even back to the upside. And so that is US dollar. Looking at GU on the daily time frame, right, we aren't surprised on why GU is breaking to the downside so hard, right? We can see that its entire nature. It will start with that initial impulse to the downside, followed by a huge and long time of liquidation and profit taking, followed by another impulse. And so all we're in right now is just another relief stage for another continuation down. So I wouldn't be surprised, like I was stating on the webinar, if this just continues to drop all the way back to the downside. That is a possibility. But one thing to take into consideration is that this structure does have to liquidate and does have to start to pull back at some point, as this cannot continue to keep pushing to the downside. And so one thing we do want to take into consideration, guys, is if you guys look left, you guys can see that there was a very, very strong area of support / resistance that was being held by both the buyers and the sellers. So I wouldn't be surprised if this starts to decelerate, makes a strong enough impulse, small pullback, and starts to look to rally to that previous zone that it did in fact break. One thing to take into consideration is that if this does happen, that's going to be treated as relief, or it's going to be treated as a short-term correction, simply for the fact that you are still stating that the initial impulse is still to the downside. And if that does start to decelerate, you're going to look for that impulse, small-term pullback, and that's going to be a rally all the way back to the downside, forming that as the descending trend line that will start that entire bearish momentum, right? So once again, just like we were talking about before on AU and things like that, and on EU, it's all going to be dependent on what happens within this region. But looking at it from a 4-hour perspective as of right now, we can see that we are in a bit of a complex structure for two reasons. After we did make that initial impulse right here, right, We did in fact form this reversal pattern, but more importantly, it was range bound. And so once we in fact broke the lows of the range, right, definitely told us that momentum is going to continue to the downside. Therefore, this reversal pattern now becomes invalidated, and we're just going to state here that, you know what, it is simply a ranging game after it does break out. And so looking at it as of right now, we can see that structure did in fact break the lows, making this more of an impulsive channel. One thing to note about this channel is that its behavior starts with an impulse followed by a pullback, another impulse, pullback, etc. Right? And so what could potentially happen on pound dollar? Well, one thing to take into consideration is that the safest plays are going to be first from an impulse below the weekly support, followed by a small term continuation pattern, structurally retesting that previous low. And if that breaks, that's going to be your trade all the way back to the downside. Now, if that doesn't happen, what could happen is this could start to create a double bottom, rally, short-term pullback, and from there, rally back to that descending trend line, right? It's not a big buy, guys, until you guys are in fact cracking that previous region. For you guys to see a big buy, you have to see a strong enough impulse up, followed by some type of pullback, and that would be your rally back up. So if that sell doesn't happen, guys, you're looking to take the buys above here short-term, small continuation pattern, run that to the descending trend. Then be careful because this ascending channel can be treated as relief for another downside play, or if it does impulse to the upside hard enough, followed by a short-term continuation, you guys can look to run that to the weekly resistance. And so that would be pound dollar. Looking at AUD USD as of right now, guys, once again, we were stating on the weekly time frames that you should be very careful about about that trend. Remember, trends are not straight line shots, but consistence of highs and lows. Even though that ascending trend broke, right, that weekly support never broke, sitting right here. And we can see that, you know what, structure has started to decelerate and create some of the same and similar behavior that has formed that initial impulse. And so we won't be surprised if that does in fact occur. So pulling it to the daily time frame as of right now, guys, looking at what has happened in the past in this area, we can see that structure will make strong enough impulses, but at some point start to decelerate, impulse, small continuation, and rally up, just like EU and all these other pairs, right? Even though this has impulsed, right, notice what it starts to do. It's created that reversal pattern, right? And so with that, guys, if this can make a strong enough impulse up, followed by small term continuation, I have no problem seeing that rally all the way back to the top. So be very careful on what happens within here. Do not be surprised if you see a lot of whipsaw and a lot of head fakes. Let me take that out real quick, guys. And so looking at what's going on with AU as of right now, if structure can make a strong enough impulse up, small pullbacks to those previous highs, you could take this as a short-term trade. Remember, you're going to be treating this movement as relief, right, because of that initial drop. Now, one thing to factor in, guys, is that you do have this entirety of this ascending channel. Apologies about that initial one. This is ideally the relief that you're looking at. But treating that entire bullish momentum is still short-term or relief. Now, the bears would only occur as if you can make a strong enough impulse down below the previous lows that have failed to break, followed by a short-term continuation pattern, and you're looking to run it down. Please take into consideration that this is a range-bound pair, and so you're really just looking to play the lows or the highs at the range. Now, one thing to state is that there is more upside to downside because we are now falsely breaking that weekly support as well as that monthly resistance. And so with that, guys, we could potentially expect a strong enough impulse to the upside, followed by some type of pullback, and then from there expect that big rally all the way back to the top. So be very careful in this area. Last but not least, Nzdusd USD. Looking at it from the daily time frame, same thing like AUD USD. You do have that initial impulse to the downside. You do see that reversal pattern, impulse, another reversal pattern. Dependence on how big of that initial sharp movement it makes will really warrant on how big of a push we're going to get to the upside. If you guys do get that initial impulse up, small continuation pattern, look to run that back to this previous low that was broken. One thing to factor in is that if this does happen, guys, right, you do want to state that this can be treated as relief for another downside play if you do start to reject and decelerate near there. But if we do make a strong enough impulse up and we keep going, you guys could certainly target the tops. Pulling it to a 4-hour time frame as of right now, guys, you can see that Nzdusd USD is simply just range bound, breaking above and below the previous lows, hence falsely breaking, but you can see that that is the range that it is in. And so there really are two possibilities: strong enough impulse up, small pullback, ride that straight to the weekly resistance, or B, this simply breaks out, you get a strong enough impulse, small pullback, you guys are still trading in the range, and you guys can look to run that all the way back to the downside. In reality, you are going to be dealing with some serious firepower there, and so probably the safest play for the sells is below the lows, pullback, and you guys can look to run that down to the monthly support. Failure to do so will just warrant consolidation within this range, and you guys are not something that's not something that you guys should be interested in. And so with that, guys, that is the breakdown of all the dollar index pairs for the next 24 to 72 hours. I hope you guys enjoyed that.